The year is 1924. The first Macy's Day Parade was held. J. Edgar Hoover is promoted to the head of the FBI. And in Great Britain, Sir Nigel Gresley, the chief mechanical engineer of the LNER, was viewing the results of a maritime high pressure water tube boiler system. He's impressed, and so he approached one Harold Yarrow, head of Yarrow and Company of Glasgow, the same company that provided many of the Royal Navy's boilers in the era before the capital ship holiday, with a proposal to build a boiler that could be used for a locomotive. Thus, the Class W1 Hush Hush was born. The boiler that Yarrow produced was not one of their usual designs, which makes a fair bit of sense considering the size of naval boilers. In operation, it was more similar to Woolnow's design, has been described as an evolution of the Broughton-Deffner water tube firebox, and the firebox extended to become the entire boiler. The boiler resembled two elongated marine boilers joined end to end, with the usual Yarrow triangular arrangement of a central large steam drum above the two separate water drums, linked by multiple rows of curved tubes. The firebox area was wide and spanned with frames, placing the water drums at the limits of the British loading gauge on their railway system. The forward boiler region was narrow, and with the water drums placed between the frames. The space outboard of the tubes formed a pair of exhaust flues leading forward. A large space outside these flue walls, but inside the boiler casing, was used as an air duct for an air inlet, a crude rectangular slot beneath the smokebox floor, which had the effect of both preheating the combustion air and also cooling the outer casings to prevent overheating. Longitudinal superheater tubes were placed between the steam generating tubes. The third area forward contains the superheater headers, the regulators, and the smokebox. The external boiler casing remained at much the same width throughout, giving an overall triangular but curved appearance. The lower edge of each section stepped upwards, and this was very obvious externally, as you can see here. Working pressure was of 450 psi as opposed to the 180 psi of the contemporary Gresley A1 Pacifics. The heavy forgings of the main drums were built in Sheffield by John Brown Shipyard. The boiler was constructed and fitted to the frames by Yarrow in Glasgow, involving the rolling chassis being carried over, ironically, the LMS, carefully sheeted, of course, to avoid inspection by the LNER's main rivalry, in case of, almost Cold War paranoia. In doing so, the locomotive generated its nickname, the Hush Hush. The name stuck. This chassis was of a 4-2-2-4 wheel arrangement, as the center drive rods hadn't yet been fitted. And presumably, the LMS were confused by the nearly 40-year-old obsolete design of this wheel arrangement, and so probably assumed that Gresley had lost his mind, and so they didn't look under the sheet too closely. The first works photographs with the boiler cladding in photographic gray were taken in Glasgow, with a wooden dummy center driver and coupling rod added for the photo. As innovative as the boiler was, the chassis was less so. The Gresley Pacifics would provide the chassis and running gear. This was a tried and true design and would provide an excellent basis to test this new boiler. There was just one problem: the boiler was too long. No problem though, thought Gresley and Doncaster. We'll just make it longer and add another trailing truck. This resulted in the only standard gauge 464 Hudson to ever run on British rails. Though it should be noted that unlike most Hudsons, the trailing wheels were independent rather than a single four-wheeled bogie. The lead trailing truck, confused yet, was basically the same as the Pacifics, with a Cartazzi axle box and outside frames. The real rear axle had inside frames and Bissell trucks. The high pressure necessitated compounded expansion, with steam first going to high pressure inside cylinders and being fed into two larger low pressure cylinders, outside. See American compound malaise as an example. In contrast to the most Gresley Pacifics, this locomotive had 4 cylinders, more in line with LMS Pacifics of Stanier's designs, rather than the more typical 3-cylinder designs of most Gresley engines. Anywho, Gresley incorporated an ingenious, unique system for giving independent cutoff to the high-pressure cylinders with only two sets of Walschaerts valve gear, derived from the outside cranks on the von Boris principle, and using the inside half-length expansion link. And yes, I did just read that pretty much off of Wikipedia verbatim. Any engineers, feel free to explain to me exactly what that means in the comments, because I have no idea. The locomotive, classified W1 and numbered 10,000, was completed at Darlington Works in 1929. The locomotive had the famous corridor tender, more on that in a bit. It ran non-stop services from London to Edinburgh to Tyne in 1930. However, steaming was poor during test runs, and in spite of a number of mods initially to the exhaust, and then later to other aspects of the locomotive, boiler performance never reached the standards of an equivalent fire tube boiler. Another problem that was never fully solved was air leakage into the boiler casing. The corridor tender I mentioned earlier was similar to the 10 built in 1928 for the A1 and A3 Pacifics, and were used to similar non-stop services like the Flying Scotsman, the train, not the locomotive. The W1 tender differed from the 1928 tenders in a few details. The Hush Hush tender was provided with disc wheels rather than spoked, and the front of the tender was designed to fit the W1 cab specifically. However, the W1 concept was not to be. By the 1930s, it was clear to the LNER that there was not much further progress that could be made, and so the locomotive was taken to Doncaster Works. However, rather than scrapping the locomotive, the LNER rebuilt it as a conventional boiler, three-cylinder locomotive more akin to the standard Gresley Pacific layout. A modified A4 boiler was fitted. The valves were considered undersized for the 20-inch diameter cylinders, which would hinder its speed. The locomotive retained its four trailing wheels and resulted in a more spacious cab for the driver and fireman. I'm sure crew were very happy about this. The tender, though not rebuilt, was modified to fit the new cab. The tender had streamlined plating on the top, but this was removed in early 1938, and it had a longer coal chute. Number 10,000 never carried a name, though it did carry a small work plate on the smoke deflectors bearing its running number. We've already discussed its nickname Hush Hush. It also gained the nickname the Galloping Sausage, thanks to, well, just look at it. In 1929, there were plans to name it British Enterprise, but this was dropped, despite the nameplates having been cast. In 1951, there was another plan to rename it Pegasus, but this never panned out either. In 1948, the Big Four merged into British Railways under the British government, and in a works visit in May and June of that year, the corridor tender was replaced with a more standard tender and was renumbered to 60700 and was given the BR livery and crest. On September 1st, 1955, 60700 left Peterborough and the front bogie frame broke. The locomotive derailed at 20 miles an hour at Westwood Junction. She was recovered and repaired. She was withdrawn on June 1st, 1959 and was broken up at Doncaster later that year. However, the first of the two tenders survives into preservation. Corridor tender 5484 is now attached to LNER 4488, Union of South Africa. And for those of you who want to add this locomotive to their layout, Hornby released a ready-to-run model in 2020, although much in the spirit of its prototypical inspiration, it seems to have had several mechanical issues depending on the model. There's some mixed reviews on the internet. I don't have one, so to determine if you should get one, I would recommend review channels such as Sam's Trains or any of the other ones. There's many. LaserJet has one. There's lots of them. So if you're looking to add this locomotive to your layout and don't want to buy a kit to do it, Hornby does have a model, but do your research before you spend an obscene amount of money on it. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.